Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Children and Young People Scrutiny Panel, 7th of December 2023. My name's Councillor Tim Needham and I'm Chair today. We'll do some introductions in a bit, but a bit of housekeeping first. We're not expecting a fire alarm today, and so if one sounds, can people leave the building as quickly as possible by the way of nearest assembly point at the public square outside Cast. No roll call will be undertaken. Thank you for that. Mobile phones. I would like to ask everybody to ensure the mobile phone is switched to silent mode. Filming of the meeting. This meeting will be audio visually recorded and will be available to view on the Council's YouTube channel. Can I ask all those present to use their microphones to ensure the audio can be captured? There's no public in attendance, so we're good for that. Apologies for absence, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies for absence from Councillor Hempshaw, Antoinette Drinkhill, Rhiannon Nelson and Lee Galls. Thank you. Sorry, Chair, and Councillor Cox.
Thank you. But can't forget Councillor Cox, can we? Okay, so there's no public or press, so we don't have to consider them to be excluded from this meeting. Declarations of interest. If anyone has any declarations of interest, could you please declare this on the appropriate form and give that to Christine after the meeting. So thanks for that. Okay. Item 4. Quickly already, item 4. Meeting minutes of the Children and Young People's Overview and Scrutiny Panel meeting held on the 31st of October 2023. I'd just like to say, can the minutes be agreed as a correct record subject to the addition of concerns were raised by a youth counsellor with regard to accessing drinking water in schools, and it was agreed that this would be investigated, being added to the safeguarding and protection of children in schools paragraph. Can I have a seconder for that? Thank you, Charlie. So, minutes agreed. Are we okay with that? Thank you for that. Section 5 is public statements, and I don't think we've got any of those today either, so that's really good. So, okay, into Section 6 with education achievement outcomes for all key stages 2023. Would you like to sum something up, or would you prefer to go straight into questions?
I think if committee are okay, we can go straight into questions.
Fine, thank you for that. Okay, so question 1 is mine. Page 11, paragraph 9, it is positive news that the majority of schools across all phases compared with 2019, data shows achievement as either sustained or surpassed, especially those from disadvantaged households. This is a testament to the hard work of children and young people who achieve these results and all those who work in these settings and considering there also remains a COVID legacy to overcome. Were there any notable surprises in school setting results? And if yes, do we know why?
So I guess I'll kind of start this off and then I'll hand over to Jane a little bit more detail. I think the first thing I would say is often I think we think about achievement outcomes and the impact of COVID, and we think actually it was those young people who sat their exams in COVID. I think in reality, the cohort that sat their exams this year were actually the most affected by COVID. So I think we should kind of note that. I think that's why the outcomes are actually quite good. So actually, and it's also the first year that we have gone to fully no mitigation kind of assessment. So, you know, in previous years been a slight mitigation around the assessment. So I think to kind of note that. What I would say for the vast majority of schools, actually, exactly as you say, some have been surpassed, some have been sustained, a slight decline in kind of others. What I can tell you, and more than happy to sort of share a more detailed run as we get it in terms of validation, but actually what's quite good is I think we've seen a number of schools, arguably in much more kind of complex areas, who actually have significantly improved to the point of actually being level, if you like, with other historical areas of Doncaster that perhaps don't have the same level of complexity. So I guess what I'm saying there is a number of our schools in deprived areas have made significant or marginal kind of improvements. And I think that's a really important point to make. So we're starting to see that level of traction. Jane, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Leanne. Just to echo Leanne, that the gains in terms of these last outcomes do show a continuing trajectory of improvement, of incremental improvement for Doncaster across the schools. In terms of the specific question, it's important that we recognise prior achievement when we discuss any cohort in terms of variations, but certainly there have been some cohorts that have shown a significant improvement. There's been marginal improvements or where achievement rates have been sustained or held. There have been some schools, a small number of schools, who have shown a decline in some measures. But again, I think it's really important that some of those schools and some of those cohorts were serving populations that were most affected by the pandemic in terms of missed education. There is a flip side to that as well. But certainly we are working with those schools as part of our support and challenge process in terms of school improvement and expect to be able to get back on track with those schools. But I think one of the most important and significant points to make is despite the challenges of the pandemic, the fact that Doncaster has held or improved is one significant point to note. The other important point to note is that there are some of our schools that do serve particularly high communities that have a high levels of deprivation and disadvantage. And actually, some of those schools, there were some schools that showed some significant improvement. And the fact that, that is really important because it shows the excellent work that they've done with regards to the catch-up curriculum, where they've not only held or surpassed, they've actually flipped the trend for those children who the evidence shows were the most impacted by lost learning as a result of the pandemic. So, good news.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it says any notable surprises, and they could be positive, couldn't they?
Yes.
So I guess the flip side of the question is there any good practice that can be pinched and shared?
Yes, and I think certainly, still part of the support and challenge process about system leadership. It's really about looking at from a strengths-based perspective. We talk about closing the gap, but it's also about how we stretch and challenge and in that respect and learn in terms of from where we've got great practice. So absolutely, that's all part of the school improvement journey that we bring our leaders together on.
Sometimes innovation is a good thing, isn't it? But it's a brave thing as also equally. Any questions on the panel? No, right, thank you for that. The next question is me again. Lucky you. Question 2 is about page 11, paragraph 10. The report states that progress 8 is in line with national average, but the results are not in line with national average. Please, is there an explanation why this is the case?
Yes, certainly. I mean, Progress 8 Progress 8 scores are very much, being in line with average means that those pupils have made typical levels of progress through their secondary school career, given their outcomes at Key Stage 2. That's reflecting on the prior attainment that I was referencing. But because of their outcomes at Key Stage 2, where they were below average, even though they've made typical levels of progress throughout secondary school, it means that their outcomes at Key Stage 4 will also be below average.
Is that like a bit of a COVID catch-up thing as well? Is there something going on with that?
It's about starting points. So I think it's about ensuring. So if the starting point when coming out of Key Stage 2 into Key Stage 3 is very much that they were sort of achieving at X and another child is achieving at Y, given that we're all very different. The Progress 8 is important because an important measure because it shows the added value of the teaching and learning through the career in school. So that's really positive, that those children with lower prior attainment at Key Stage 2 have made the same levels of progress as their peers in secondary, but because their starting point was lower, their end point will be lower as well, comparatively.
Councillor Hogarth.
Yeah. Do you have any statistics to compare them with locally? i.e. Barnsley, Rotherham, Sheffield, any South Yorkshire, we're doing better than them.
Okay, that's a really good question. So obviously, indicatively, we do have conversations. It's not appropriate that I declare our other authorities' kind of outcomes. I think what I can say to you is actually that I think Doncaster was pleased with its outcomes, to the sense that because we kind of showed an improvement across those key stages. But I can tell you, whether that be regionally or nationally, that wasn't the case across the board, kind of elsewhere. So I think in that sense, quite kind of pleased about that. And just to, I guess, on Jane's previous point as well, if I may, I think there's a difference between sort of progress 8 is about historical progress, and attainment 8, which is you kind of measure nationally, is almost like that. It's not as simple as this, but it's almost like that moment in time. When you sit your formative examinations, and it's that comparison between the journey and you actually sitting the exam. More than happy when I've got that, Councillor Hogarth, to actually kind of share that, but you'll appreciate that in order for me to do that, I would need permission from neighbouring authorities. But actually, I think from our point of view, we fared well.
Okay, thank you. Any more points? Councillor Durant?
Just come back to Leanne. It may be then appropriate once they have announced their results that we can maybe provide a chart to councillors so we can do a more local comparison.
Thank you. So, thank you for that. Over to the next question. I will hand over to Councillor Durant. Thank you.
On page 11, paragraph 10, it states the outcomes for pupils with EHCPs are in line with national average. But for those with SEND support, it's not. What's the reason for this?
Start that off and then pass it kind of on, Martin. So I think there's a couple of things in this for me. I suppose the first point I would make, and it's not where we want it to be, but I think there's something about a little bit of recognition that actually, whilst we're nowhere near where we need to be, we have made some progress. And I think that, so we know it's a historical issue from a Doncaster perspective, but actually what you can begin to see is traction both for young people with an EHCP and young people with SEND support. I think SEND support is significantly more complex in many ways because of the kind of the nature of the kind of the process, and therefore, as part of the work that Martin is doing in SEND transformation, so there's a segue coming, essentially we're starting to look very differently about how we provide that support and how we support schools directly with that. So that's my segue over to Martin to talk about that.
Thanks, Leanne. And it reflects, I suppose, some of the themes that you'll have seen both in the second report tonight, but also in the previous reports that we've delivered, that historically the drive towards EHCPs as being the primary priority in terms of making intervention has meant that there is a need to make sure that we adjust our infrastructure in order to make sure we're intervening earlier. And this is the theme of all of our strategic delivery. And what we know is that there is a variability in provision at the earliest points for those youngsters who are not at that point where they need an education, health and care plan, or they don't have an education, health and care plan. So the work that we're doing through the strategy is about, one, making sure that there are a really strong mechanism for ensuring that schools identify need at the earliest point and know what to do when they've identified it, and that they're supported in delivering interventions that will allow youngsters' needs to be met at the earliest point. So we've got a lot of work planned or that's being delivered at the moment around professional development to schools, around ensuring that our funding system supports youngsters without the need for an education, health and care plan, because partially some of those outputs for EHCP youngsters are a reflection of the fact that a large amount of resource is invested into their support. And what we want to do is to make sure that that resource is invested in those who have the needs, who require it, and for a broader category of need. So we're also working to ensure that we've got the tools in the system and that our services are working at an earlier point to discuss with schools the provision that they make and to make sure that there's a consistent approach towards meeting need at the earliest point. So we can see that in areas whereby those systems have been developed and are mature, that the outcomes of those youngsters who are at SEND support are good or have improved over time. And that's really the piece of work that we want to deliver as a priority in Doncaster through the SEND transformation strategy.
Right, okay, thank you. Sorry, I'll just scroll in there. Anybody got other questions on that? Are we okay with that one? Over to you again, Councillor Durant.
Okay, on page 12, paragraph 11, it mentions about the key stage 5 results. So are they now available? And if they are, how does Doncaster compare to national, and has the gap narrowed? And we note that the Doncaster key stage 5 results are improved from 2019 in paragraph 31. So do we have the results now?
In terms of validated results from the DFE, no. They're not available yet. I think as soon as they are available, we'll be able to kind of share those. I think there are some things of note that we'll watch with interest. I think, yes, we've had an improvement at Key Stage 5, which is great, but I also think we've had an improvement even at sort of AAB for kind of A-levels. That's quite a significant shift, I think, for Doncaster. I think the other thing to say about Key Stage 5 is the greater uptake on applied general, so the more technical qualifications. So there's starting to be a general recognition that that's a viable level 3 access route, and I think so that's reassuring, I guess, to some extent around our education skills strategy. So I think there's a couple of things in there. There won't be any validated results around those or the T levels, both of which have improved. But the validated results we will be able to compare for Key Stage 5 will be in relation to A levels. As soon as we have those, then happy to send something on for you to review.
Do we have a time frame? Because we did say it was expected mid-November, didn't it, within the report? So we're into December now. Is there a reason why they've been delayed, and do we have a time frame when to expect them?
So generally, I think you can expect validated results for Key Stage 4 around about kind of November. I think often it's beginning of the new calendar year for Key Stage 5. And I think it's because of the nature of the number of providers. So as soon as we have that, so we're at the behest really to some extent when that comes out from the DFE. As soon as we have that, we can get that across because those reports will be readily available. But, you know, if I was, I guess really being cautious, I would say that it might be early in the new year before we get that now.
Thank you for that. Question 5, again, is Councillor Durant. On a roll.
On a roll. Okay, so on page 12 about phonics, great news that Doncaster is 1% above national for phonics. The English hub support has been positive impact. Are all the schools who will benefit participating and working with the hub?
Hello. Yes, look, there's a variety of strategies that schools apply with regards to reading, writing and maths. Doncaster Local Authority, we have our own strategy with regards to reading, writing, maths, and that's also available to all schools. And that's about how we learn together across the system with the various strategies. But the reading, writing, maths strategy from Doncaster Local Authority, that's funded and it's monitored through Schools Forum. We've recently been there and shown some positive impacts as a result of that strategy. It's also funded through our Standards and Effectiveness team as well and delivered. So the majority of schools have accessed funding to support them to develop their phonics provision. And in terms of our Read, Write, Maths Doncaster strategy, we do have links with 2 of the English hubs. And one of those hub leads is part of our strategic steering group as well. So there's good connections, good connectivity in that space. Some schools have had more intensive support from that hub because that's been appropriate. And others have had have had more of a light touch. So it's about needs in terms of which schools. Our support and challenge schools that are in the support and challenge process have all been directed to engage with the hubs if there hasn't been prior engagement. So that has been directed as part of that formal process. And additionally, we are working with the National Literacy Trust as well, so we're extending the reach as well. So it's a rich tapestry of networks and how we encourage schools to engage with that, or how we direct them, or in terms of their risk assessment, or in terms of their need, how we encourage that positive engagement. So yes is the answer, but it depends on their need and where they're at.
Any further questions? Thank you very much. So over to question 6, which is me again. And it talks about page 12 and Key Stage 1. And we're pleased to hear that outcomes for Key Stage 1 have improved, but what are schools doing to close a relatively consistent gap to national reading, writing and maths?
Yes, an important area, of course. As I've said, schools are employing a variety of measures to close the gap to national. It's something that they prioritise in terms of either targeted support for speech and language, through intensive and comprehensive sort of South Yorkshire Talking Together programmes in terms of training, CPD for staff, particularly in the early years. And that intensive, comprehensive CPD is offered at a universal and also a targeted level. So it's very much around work around that sort of CPD and access to evidence-based programmes. Read, Write, Maths Doncaster, they've delivered Word Aware in a number of schools, and that's particularly aimed at developing children's vocabulary, and oracy is a very key development priority for the Read, Write, Maths strategy this year as well. So developing oracy, access to eminent speakers on that. There was a recent training event that was well attended with regards to best in class sort of experts with regards to oracy, and lots of great ideas about how that can move forward this next year. But certainly, in addition to Word Aware, developing children's vocabulary, it's also about enabling children to access the curriculum more effectively, because in terms of communication and language, and access to that curriculum in terms of that speech and language, that's really important. That's unlocking, key barriers. So that's why that's really prime. Impacting on raising attainment in reading, writing and maths across the wider curriculum as well. So how that cross-curricular application of reading, writing, maths is applied in schools. So those are the key areas of the Read, Write, Maths strategy in this next year. In terms of other approaches, there's an increased focus on all pupils accessing quality first teaching. This comes back to the work that we're doing with regards to the SEND transformation, building capacity in schools. In terms of the graduated approach, first point of call being the quality first teaching. And there's a wider range of scaffolding strategies being developed to support our practitioners to be able to enable access for all class, for all the pupils in the class in terms of accessing lessons and unlocking their learning potential. So the local authorities assessment and moderation offer also in terms of writing. That's been up to now primarily focused on the statutory assessment years. So the Read, Write, Maths strategy is now going to expand that across all year groups in primary. So that's going to be another key change there. And also in terms of the Read, Write, Maths Doncaster phase networks, assessment and moderation across Key Stage 1 in reading, writing, maths is going to be a consistent feature in each of the sessions in those networks. So there's a number of different approaches that will layer upon themselves, as I've said, CPD, developing capacity, quality first teaching, and then some additional scaffolding strategies for our practitioners.
Thank you for that. That's a comprehensive answer. Is there any kind of data or understanding or thinking about how young people, because we've mentioned earlier on about young people being different, is there any alternative strategies that are flexible within the classroom? So I know in secondary school it's not so flexible for obvious reasons, but in primary it is a bit more. So as part of graduated response and different things, how flexible is teaching delivery, do you know?
Well, I mean, certainly that's part of the baselining with the investment with regards to the school improvement advisors for SEND and inclusion as part of delivering better value. That is again, we've just recruited. We're going to be rolling that out in terms of that baselining with schools, in terms of their practice, their skills, their approaches, and very much tethering that to, because these posts will be part of the school improvement strategy as well. They will be tethered to the work that the Read Write Maths colleagues are doing, so that adaptation will be part of a complete package of intervention with schools, where we want to see some greater gains with regards to meeting needs in terms of adaptive teaching. And so I think what I'm saying is that we haven't got that baseline as yet. That's part of that. That's part of the approach. That's part of the investment, and certainly, in terms of going forward, part of school improvement will be about that complete package of support, advice, challenge and intervention planning, and then practitioners and schools apply that, and then we review that, and then we learn again. So I think that will be something that we'll see hopefully see a significant shift on in this next academic year.
Because it's very important, isn't it, that children are offered the right intervention at the right time, as we talk about, and education's no different to that. And of course, if the right intervention around reading, writing and numeracy is not available, then it's catch up. And by the time young people get to secondary, where there's not actually that kind of time and available to help young people catch up, I think it's crucial, isn't it? So I'm pleased to hear that, you may be able to benchline that and look at improving that even more. Thank you. Yes, Leanne.
I think it's really important to note as well that actually we've got some great examples in schools of where that's happening already. So actually what I wouldn't want you to go away with is the thought that actually that wasn't happening. I think what this does is this adds to that. But actually we've got some fantastic examples, I think, of where schools are doing that. And one of the things that we also know is that actually, the schools supporting school system, if you like. So actually schools support other schools in that. So where something works really well in a school, that's being shared across, and that's regardless of designation of the school. And we're seeing some really good examples of practice in that regard. So I just thought that was an important point to make.
That's good to hear. Thank you. And I'm pleased also that you're on the ball and you know about it already. So thank you. Any supplementary questions for that panel? Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to question 7, which is Councillor Anderson. Thank you.
Yeah, page 13, Key Stage 2. The issue of just meeting the threshold in reading is a concern, especially in the schools where it is the case for higher numbers of pupils. What work is being undertaken to support schools in ensuring pupils to become secure and develop mastery?
I'll take that one, yeah. Reading at the end of Key Stage 2, as you're aware, reading's assessed by a reading comprehension paper. And so each year marks are allocated in terms of certain thresholds that children need to get a certain amount of questions right to meet those thresholds. So sometimes children miss that threshold due to precision that they need to answer the questions. And this is something that's continually being developed in teaching and teaching practice. So, as part of those networks that I referenced earlier, as part of the Read Write Maths strategy, as part of what the approach is in terms of from a strengths-based, where there is great practice, how we share that and how ultimately CPD. Ongoing work is done in all those sort of forms to help schools to develop their reading curriculum. And each year group within Key Stage 2 is going to have a particular focus on transition, around decoding and phonics in Key Stage 1. And then in terms of that transition into Key Stage 2, lower Key Stage 2, entering into the world of some wider texts and wider reading and developing that secure comprehension in terms of ensuring that they're accessing age-appropriate texts, and that love of reading. Actually, it's not just about the reading practice itself. It is about that decoding, that understanding, and that discussion with regards to the text, and that creative understanding, and how that, you know, how teachers and young people and children can take that off into all sorts of understanding and reflections. So all of that is being encouraged, and schools are being encouraged also to use research evidence, you know, focus on evidence-based approaches to underpin the reading curriculum, make sure that the texts that they are choosing are really, as I've said, age appropriate, that there's challenge in there, and that there's creativity in there, so that they can develop that love, that joy, that love of reading, and also that key areas such as sort of fluency and comprehension are really sort of time is given to developing that within class, and also that extension work in terms of you know, in home, and encouraging parents, etc., in terms of their involvement in that space. So, and also in terms of, you know, looking at the curriculum, ensuring that the quality curriculum across Key Stage 2, and that as a result of that, we believe that children's attainment will be developed, it will be improved upon as they themselves deepen their understanding in reading, and how they access more increasingly complex texts and a wider range of texts as well. So I think all of those things, you know, will be is part of the work that we're doing to extend that mastery.
Councillor Hogarth.
Yeah, it's just, I think it might be a bit earlier, but when they stopped giving kids free books type of thing, has there any impact of that started to feed through yet? You know, a negative impact? It was stopped a couple of years ago, I think, but I wondered if there's anything started to create through of any impacts.
Yeah, I think that was one of a number of initiatives, Councillor Hogarth, and I think that one of the things that because I think you're talking about the Imagination Library stuff, I think, and although we kind of issued those books, actually we now have a very good partnership with the National Literacy Trust, for example, who are actually supporting schools who perhaps don't have the level of libraries that they did before, so they put some funding into that. They also give out books to classes as well. And actually, I think schools are involved in their own initiatives as well. So I think that actually we won't have felt the impact in a negative way simply because I think that was starting a foundation of something. So I think easing that away was because actually it was being covered by other kind of initiatives. So thankfully we haven't seen a negative kind of impact of that.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. Question 8 is another one from me. Page 14, paragraph 28, and it talks about children who were looked after in school. So good news that the outcomes for children looked after in early years, Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4 showed a significant improvement from last year. And we just wondered why there's been a decline at Key Stage 1 for the same cohort.
So I'll kind of start this off, and then I'm going to invite my colleague Rebecca to comment from a social care perspective. It's always very difficult, I would argue, to compare any cohort with another cohort because actually all children are different. But actually, it's much more difficult, I think, for children looked after, children in care. Depends on the needs and so on. But I think the other point to make is actually the cohort changes. The cohort numbers can change so significantly. So one year the numbers could be smaller than other years. So I think the strategies that are in place appear to be working. But I think that actually it's that individual difference, and rightly so, of children looked after. So I'm going to hand over to Rebecca to comment directly on that.
I think the other bit that I would add to that is if we think about the age that our children become looked after, it's often within that key stage. And often the reason they're becoming looked after is because they've experienced trauma or neglect at home. I think what this perhaps doesn't show you is the progress those children are supported to make while being looked after. It's a bit of a passion of mine that we look at the end result, don't we? We don't necessarily see that child hasn't just jumped 2 levels that year. They've been supported to jump 3 levels that year. And I think there's also something I've learned as a social worker as I become closer to education, that things like handwriting, which is really important, is a skill you need to practice, and you need to have the environment that supports you to practice that. We can offer that in care, but we're always playing a little bit of catch up sometimes. So I think for me, that key stage 1 figure is a little bit of an anomaly. Absolutely what Leanne says, very vulnerable to the intake of little people we've got coming in. But it is our group where we want to expedite that progress. And I think the assurance for me is that it isn't a lasting legacy if you look at the results. If we're looking at the results, we can see that that figure is improving. Of course, we want it to improve more. But just had a conversation with my colleague just today as well about we've got more young people, young adults entering higher education than ever before. Still smallish numbers, but we're getting better at that. And that's showing that what we do provide once a young person becomes looked after makes a difference. But sometimes we're playing catch up. And sometimes we've got to recognise that little people can only make so much progress at one time, but we're there to support it. And I think the figures start to reflect that. But absolutely concur with Leanne. Always a little bit of a wibble wobble because actually we haven't taken as many young people into being looked after, so that affects your overall percentage. But yeah, that cohort of children often coming into care have got lots of needs that we need to support in order to enable them to make progress. So I think that's how I would reflect it back.
And that's a great answer. Thank you for that. And it's not always a question that he says, oh, you know, that bit's wrong, so what are you doing about it? It's not. It's about asking a question, and it's also about, because we're passionate about, you know, our looked after young people in Doncaster, and it's about making sure that something's not missed, really. So, but that was a good answer, so thank you so much for that. Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next question. Is question 9 is Councillor Bluff. Thank you.
Thanks. Are schools with robust mock exam programmes providing better final results?
Well, so most secondary schools do have really robust sort of arrangements for mock exams, or what they call pre-public examinations now. But unfortunately, we don't have access to that internal data of schools. So unfortunately, it's not possible to specifically assign that intervention with the outcomes. So I'm sorry that I'm unable to answer that one.
Any additional questions?
Pressing the right button would help. I guess really by way of assurance, I think what we can see is whether or not teacher assessments are right. Because so when we look back at the space during kind of COVID, when actually teacher assessments were taking place for public, in place of public examinations, actually when we were looking at the outcomes as they were coming in this year, what we could clearly see is the trajectory of improvement was also predicted correctly in the teacher assessment year. So although we don't oversee the mocks, what we can see is that schools are getting their predictions and their assessments right. And you could see that as we drew that comparison, as we were looking at the results. It was just interesting to see, and I know that wasn't the case everywhere, because actually you could see where some had over-predicted, over-assessed, actually. And then what that meant was the following year, when we went to formal assessment again, actually the results dropped. We didn't see that in Doncaster, so I think that's a little bit of reassurance, hopefully.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, that concludes the questioning on that part of presentation. I'd just like to just make a left field observation, really. As a panel previously, we've spoken about reports being number heavy, and we've requested where possible we can have some kind of a visual chart. And I was listening to Radiohead earlier on, and it said he's like a detuned radio, and looking at those numbers, that's what my head is. So if we're all inclusive, can we request again that where possible we can have some pie chart, graph chart, so that it's obvious to us, please? Thank you. So moving on then to the recommendation. in paragraph 6, it's recommended that children and young people at our panel review the notes. Does the panel therefore agree with the recommendations in paragraph 6? Are we all in favour of agreeing the recommendations? Okay. Nods it is. Thank you for that. Okay, so that moves us on then to the equitable, inclusive access education for all. Again, do you want to have a brief summary, or are you prepared to go straight to questions?
I mean, I think if the panel are okay, I think we go straight into questions.
We've all read and done our research. Okay, so the first question then I'm going to hand over to Councillor Moran.
Thank you. Right, page 26, paragraph 14. What is the local authority's capacity to oversee, monitor and possibly support the elements listed? The proposed pathway changes now and into the future, because it's a big job. Just that point to begin with.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. And yes, I think the transformation is a big job, but actually this is about more efficient and cohesive working across services. As you'll know, there are challenges both in Doncaster and nationally around unmet need, parents being frustrated because children are not being assessed early enough, a lack of action at the appropriate time leading to high-cost placements. And so this piece of work, I believe, is unique nationally, and we've attracted a lot of interest both nationally and regionally about this project. And that's not to say we've completed the delivery of it, but we are working against any duplication or isolation around assessment, as in two services going and assessing the same child for the same issue. And what we're developing is a piece of work where we will pool our resources and our skills between health and education services in order to make sure that at the point where a child's needs change, or the point where there are concerns about a child, a multidisciplinary team who are located within the locality are able then to support that young person and to make sure that an assessment of need is not only made collectively, but actually delivered, and then working with this education setting to make sure that that is going to be in place, will allow us to be able to focus on meeting children's needs at the right point. And that means that in terms of some of the frustrations that some of our parents see at the moment, that we will have a much clearer, more definitive understanding of children's needs at the point at which they change. And so that allows us to be able to look at the resources that are currently identified for, particularly for the health elements actually, and make sure that they are working in tandem with the areas that, with schools and the things that are going on around schools to support them, to make sure that there's a really clear pathway. And that also extends to making sure that where we need to make additional provision for youngsters that will allow them to be able to access assessment, that we can do that by pooling our intelligence and our resources. So yes, I think the transformation is a challenge and a big job, but I would also say that our partners are completely united behind the principle that we're going to make this pathway work, and that in the long run it won't be taking more resources. It'll allow us to focus the resources that we have got.
If we can just go on from that. So you're saying we believe we've got adequate provision for the multidisciplinary support for the growing numbers of these SEND children and young people, or is the funding sufficient for such a big task?
I guess, and I think the point that I think Martin was making, Councillor Moran, which probably help is, I think where you get into, and I'll answer it probably quite directly, which is what you want. I think there's a bit about the project funding that we got from the Delivering Better Value, which is great, and that's enabling us to do the transformation. Is the DSG funding sufficient? No. Are we currently carrying a deficit? Yes. Does it, even if we are being incredibly efficient, and I don't just mean financially efficient, we are thinking about ways that we can be innovative in supporting the use of that money. So actually we are keeping it to what we consider to be an appropriate level. So we are, to some extent, making inroads on that deficit. But actually, I think it's fair to say that it would be impossible to write off that deficit given the needs of the young people. So actually, there is a gap, is the answer, really, I think, to your question. I think as long as there's a mechanism in where actually there isn't a centralised decision to force the payment of those sorts of deficits, actually we can continue in the way we did. I think if that deficit had to be consumed, for example, then that would give us only our DSG, which wouldn't be sufficient in order to fund the needs. And I think that's why one of the things that we're beginning to do as a bit of a sort of a check and balance, it's part of our efficiencies work, is we're working directly with individual areas and schools. So we are, as well as the work that Martin's doing for the future, we're actually putting some support in now directly with schools to provide support here and now to enable young people who are perhaps send support at the moment to get the right support as early as possible. But yeah, if on the current budget, notwithstanding the deficit, there isn't sufficient money in the overall budget now.
Any supplementary questions? Councillor Elgarth.
Just on the funding and what have you, you've got page 32, the total expenditure and what have you. At the bottom, previous total costs at Q1. Can you explain what that's referring to? Because it looks as though it's an annual figure, but this is referring to Q1.
Yeah, so what it does, what we do on a quarterly basis is almost predict what that would look like at year end. So although you report on at Q1, you're saying that actually with the continued need, that's what it would look like at year end. So actually, and with the same Q2, Q3, Q4.
And following on from that, on that same page, like in 26-27, you're going to save over 2 million a year. Nearly all of that is coming from out of area savings. Is that realistic?
Very, and I'll start this off and then I'll hand over to Martin. It is. So just to give you, and it's the same out of area placements, it doesn't matter which area of the kind of the business, but the costs of out of area placements are increasing exponentially. So the market cost is increasing. So to give you an indication, we have examples of where young people are in out of area provision and it can be around about £120,000 a year. Don't be grudged if it's the right support for the child at the right time, then it's the right thing to do. I think what we are trying to do is to make sure that where possible, we've got provision in Doncaster. So a couple of examples of that would be, where we did the special purpose vehicle around Big Picture, where we're extending Big Picture to go to Key Stage 2 now to allow for that. The setting up of the social, emotional, mental health hubs, because that will then cater for 40 of our young people. We don't have provision at the moment for social, emotional, mental health. Therefore, those young people do have to take up out of area provision, which would cost us significantly more than having the young people in borough. So I'll stop there, but Martin, didn't know you want to add to that.
I think you said it mostly. I think what we know obviously is that in terms of both cost and quality, we are able to control in-borough provision much better than we are where you're making placements into the broader independent market. And so our objective is to make sure that we're producing, working with our school sector, really high quality placements for our young people, and we've invested in some innovative provision, and we have worked really hard with people who we know have very good form in delivering good or outstanding provisions for youngsters with very complex needs to extend that. And as Leanne has already said, if you looked at the unit cost per placement of creating in-borough provision, by comparison to out-of-borough provision, it is a very significant difference. And I think we've called on the moral integrity of our school system as well, because we've been very transparent around funding and around placements and sufficiency. And there's a really strong sense in our school partnerships of wanting to collaborate to be able to make that provision work. And in terms of the rest of that value question, what we also know, as I've indicated already, is that if we're meeting needs at the right time and funding goes into the right young people at the right time, that will have a significant measure of prevention to stop youngsters coming to crisis and ending up in out of authority placements. And that is very much the thrust of our investment, and there's a lot of work ongoing, working through 2 working groups with schools at the moment to make sure that we can get a funding model that is absolutely predicated upon evidence of the need for the resources. And that for us is going to be fundamental to making sure that we've got a fair system, but one that prevents costs further down the line.
Any additional questions? I'd just think, in terms of out of city provision across, looked after and across schools and across everything is a challenge that lots of councils have been fighting and struggling with for many, many years. So I think this is, it's real positive news that actually things, different ways are being approached, and hopefully that'll be not only beneficial for the coffers of the city council to be able to invest in other things, but it'll also have a dramatic effect on young people who actually need to be where they're from in most instances. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Next question is mine, and it's page 29. Paragraph 15, and it talks about the hubs and the 40 SCMH places that'll be filled by January. I've got a couple of questions on that. Are there places for January 24th ready to go, or will there be a delay on that? I'm not quite sure about that. So that's my first question.
With projects such as this, the unexpected can get in the way, but not significantly. The first hub has opened this week with a number of young people in Thorn, and we're really pleased with that. We also have 3 others who will be opening at various points during the spring term. There have been 2 delays. We wanted them all open by January, but there have been 2 delays. One regarding having to take some extra surveys around flood risk in one of the schools following recent weather. So that set us back a little while, but it's not a significant problem. And the second one being about some lack of clarity around land ownership in order to get sign-off from the trust who are involved in it. We didn't predict that happening, but again, it isn't a significant problem, but it's set back a few steps. So, yeah, the rest of the hubs, there's another one of the hubs will open on January the 12th, I believe. So, we have various points during the spring term, we'll be opening the rest of them. We have been working with families and obviously with schools to try and make sure we've got the right mix in terms of young people who are coming to it. But also there's been an enormous amount of work gone on in terms of provision and intervention. And we're working with trusts who, as I've said already, have got real experience in making this sort of provision work. And we're excited about it because of the reasons that you've already said, Councillor Needham, about keeping young people in their communities, but it's also about the enriching opportunities that the other young people within and the curriculum and the teachers will have through embracing a broader range of need in their schools and settings. And I think we're at a point where we know that those schools who are offering that provision are really very much embracing it on a whole school basis rather than it being an adjunct to the school, and so for that it's really important. But we know that is the first phase of the work, and that as time goes on, particularly as we have when we develop a really strong sense of what actually is the prevailing need at each phase, we'll have a stronger picture as time goes on about what it is that we need to commission in order to make sure we're getting the intervention right. So time frame, yes, we're slightly behind schedule, but actually a lot of work is going on to make sure that happens very quickly.
Okay, thank you. Some supplementary questions on that. If they're successful and, word gets round, what's in as 40 places, what's the process if capacity is outstripped by demand?
Again, I think a lot of the work that we've already discussed tonight is about making sure that instead of managing demand, we're managing need. So if every school is identifying children in the same way, if funding goes into schools and support and advice goes into schools to make sure they're meeting those needs in the right way and they're intervening in the right way, then that's going to allow us to make sure that we've got a really clear picture of what the needs are across the borough. And so we know that at the moment demand exceeds supply, but actually what we want to be able to do is to make sure that we're making detailed judgments about what it is that children require. So we're currently working with the whole of our specialist estate to be absolutely clear about what needs can they accommodate and what are the implications of that in order to make sure that there's a match between those young people and the schools that they go into. So, we know at the moment that placements, the pressure on placements, it will remain with us for a period of time. But whilst that's happening, we are reshaping the way that the local system works so that, we can over time start to turn that tap off.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Durant.
Yeah, just a clarification, if you don't mind. These hubs, are they accessible to people that are not in education but are being taught at home?
They absolutely are on the basis of need. So, we are prioritising young people who whose needs profile meets that of a specialist setting. And so you going through the legal processes for those youngsters, we will then ascertain, working with the family, whether or not it's the right form of provision. And that could be, and we do have incidents of young people who have moved into the local area and are in need of a school place and have had a previous specialist place. And in those situations, obviously those children would be a priority for a provision like that.
Any further questions? Okay, thank you.
Councillor Needham, sorry, can I just make one additional point? No, it's okay, it's not my fault entirely. I just wanted to make the point, though, I think in that instance, Councillor Durant, that the young person would need to be allocated a role of a school, because otherwise a young person, albeit electively home educated, if they weren't allocated a role on a school, essentially that would almost deem an SEMH hub at that point would almost become an unregistered provision, which it isn't. So from a legal point of view. So I think they're accessible by young people who are electively home educated, but they would need to be on a school role, which is easy to kind of navigate. But I think it's a really important point to make, because actually technically a young person who is electively home educated isn't on a role of a school. So I just wanted to make that point.
And in terms of that then, which is quite interesting, how is that navigated by families who may not know that?
Well, that would be through, so Jane Creswell's team. So the attendance team, they would kind of look at that. So actually that advice and guidance comes through that. And actually we're developing an overall toolkit just to make that a bit easier. So that's how they'd find that out.
Thank you for that. Okay, thank you for that. Moving on then to question 3, and it's Councillor Bluff.
In paragraph 15, it mentions a number of stakeholder groups and partners have been set up to deliver the SEND strategy. Who are these stakeholder groups and partners, please?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. It's been a lot of the work over the last years making sure that we are listening particularly to the voice of our young people and families and the lived experience of people who've been through the system, but also making sure that we reflect those views and those conversations back to everybody who's working in our local system. And so there's a pyramid, I suppose, of interactions in terms of those stakeholders, starting with the local area SEND board, which is a relatively small group, but it's a group obviously who has the key leads around health and social care and education in it, but also our parent group and our parent engagement work through the Making a Difference group is represented on there, but also our Children and Young People SEND board as well. And our Children and Young People SEND board meets every 5 weeks and has young people from right across the spectrum and age range. And they have a set of priorities, and they hold to account the people who are responsible for services, and they do 2 in every meeting. And I have to say they're quite robust in their challenge, and they also are in the business of filming a number of videos about their stories, which we are using in all of our training sessions with the workforce, because they're really honest about their journeys. So they're the critical group, if I'm really honest with you, and they are the first people who speak in our SEND board. They will get up and they will talk about what their experience is and what has happened in their meetings, and they devise the agenda, and they then devise questions for people who have come in order to make sure that we are all delivering on their priorities. So the SEND strategy, totally predicated on the views of children and families. And just to say, just in terms of our parent groups, and again, we meet with those parents group on a half-termly basis, but we also meet with various groups of parents as well, and individuals. We've also currently have a survey of parents' views, which is out and about at the moment, that parents are responding to. And it's an ongoing cycle of review and using that information in order to be able to check ourselves and our priorities, but then make sure we're covering the right things. So we then have a head teachers SEND strategy group, and then head teachers briefings. We have 15 on the head teachers group. We have between 60 and 70 head teachers usually at the briefings, which are half-termly. We have a special needs coordinators group who are really leading the way on lots of the things that we're doing. And so they feed back into the loop around our SEND board. We then have funding groups around SEND that I've mentioned already. We also have a group of our SENCOs who are currently working on the needs descriptors that we're using to make sure that we identify children at the right time. And then also we loop all this back through Schools Forum, because that's where the big decisions about the finances are made. So we try to make sure that we're managing that loop of information, and we're carrying messages from one place to the next so that everybody can hear the voice of practitioners as well as people with lived experience. And just to say also, we're in regular conversation with the main national bodies such as DFE and Ofsted, and we also work on a regional and sub-regional level across other authorities in order to be able to share strategies and information as well, and working with practitioners through various groups through health as well to focus on those things. So there's a big old grid of different groups that we feed our messages through, and I think part of the skill of trying to get this piece of work done is to make sure that we're maintaining engagement in the narrative so that people can hear back people's experiences, but also can hold us to account on the pace of delivery.
Any additional questions, panel? Okay, thank you for that. Moving on then to next question, question 5. Councillor Hogarth.
What will happen concerning the historic and continuing overspend of the high needs block, i.e. deficit reduction, when savings in the future will only reduce future overspends?
Shall I kind of start that off, Martin? If you've got a magic wand, that would be amazing, Councillor Hogarth, if I'm honest. That would be fabulous if you could give me a magic wand. I think it's pretty much to the response that I gave before, really, around, I think what we can do is I'll describe it as stem the flow, so that actually we are only funding high cost placements where it's absolutely necessary. I think where we can put developments into Doncaster so that young people are closest to home, that will actually make significant inroads to the deficit. We have a management plan, if you like, that we're working with the DFE on, and actually with our own finance department. But actually what we can't do, I'm not sure any local authority can do this, is actually wipe out the DSG deficit. What I can say to you is actually, I think broadly, and I think this is recognised, isn't it, by people that we work with as part of the Delivering Better Value, Martin, there's a recognition that what we are doing is we are managing ours quite effectively. And when, although it looks quite stark, compared to many other places, our deficit is actually relatively low. And I use that advisedly because it doesn't feel low. It certainly isn't low when we have conversations about it, and we'd want it not to be. So I think we're working as hard as we possibly can on it. But actually, if there was a point at which we were asked to resolve that completely, I'm sure, like many other local authorities, we wouldn't be in a position to do that. By that I mean, actually, we can't reduce it to the point of zero because actually there just isn't enough money in the pot to kind of do the job. Martin, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just it's in the context of a £3.5 billion shortfall nationally, and that there are many authorities, as Leanne says, who are really struggling with not just their current position, but their way forward as well. And I think the Department for Education is scrutinising us for our deficit management plan on a very regular basis, but also positively are positive that a lot of the big factors that you'd need to control in order to manage your deficit appropriately are being addressed. And you know, those things are around the things we've talked about tonight: early investment, fair funding, improving the sufficiency of local placements, and ensuring that there's accountability about the spend as well. So, you know, those are the things that we know that we can control in order to make sure that we're getting it right, both for young people and also making sure that we're getting it right on a cost basis as well, because those things are not mutually exclusive. But it is, you know, it is a concern right across many local authorities. And again, we network with those authorities very, very regularly around what does best practice look like? How do we support each other?
Any additional questions? Okay, thank you. Charlie, over to you again.
Stonehill's new post-16 provision is amazing. How many businesses are working with them to provide work experience? And how will this translate into meaningful and successful employment post-18? How is the local authority working with Stonehill? How many people have they got employed from Stonehill? And that, some facts on that.
I'm really pleased you've asked that question. I think Stonehill are probably sick of the sight of us, actually, but we're immensely excited about the work that's going on in that school. We are working together on a number of projects at the moment, and the senior leaders from Stonehill attend a number of our meetings, are represented on our SEND board, and have a very steering role in terms of the changes that we're making in the local system, but also a number of their youngsters sit on our SEND shadow board and influence from that level as well. And we have regular conversations where I go in and speak to their school council and their post-16 groups just to hear their experiences and also to hear the things that could be better. So really pleased about that. Around work experience, I couldn't tell you the number of places that are working with Stonehill at the moment, but I know I've had them described to me, and there are a significant number of local employers. For the council, we are currently having that conversation at the moment. So we have brought in a team of 2 people who are working on developing work experience and supported internships in the council. And we have had that conversation corporately about how can we now make sure that we significantly grow the number of placements, and that member of staff in our skills team is actively the person whose role it is to make sure that we're growing that provision. But again, our children and families, our young people have been really positive about the development of that work in Stonehill. And I think for us, this is a part of the strategy, because what we want to do now is learn from themselves and some of the other providers we've got, so that we're making sure that there is a much broader scope of opportunities available to our young people post-16 in relation to employment. We know it's an area where, you know, we need to act with urgency to engage them. But we are doing so through our Employers Send Forum as well. We're having those conversations and pushing on, and we're looking at kind of making sure that we're doing more engagement as time goes on.
If I can just add a little bit to that, I think there's, so as part of the Send and Inclusion Quality Assurance Panel, which is where actually we agree placements, when it's post-16, one of the very clear criteria is there, not just tell us about the vocational offer and the life skills that you can offer to young people. Tell us actually about how you are going to support, where it's appropriate, young people getting meaningful employment in a way that works for them. So I think that we've started to push a lot harder on that. So our providers, if you like, more broadly, have between our good providers have between 40 and 60% success rate in young people going into employment from post-16 from SEN, which is great. It's not appropriate for all young people, and you'll see in the report that actually our NEAT figures for young people has with SEN has improved significantly, and so it should. And I think the point that Martin was making about the employability forum, actually a lot of local employers are really keen to engage, because I think we've genuinely started to myth bust the principle about SEND, because I think if you're not careful, people get wrapped into this. If you're talking about SEND, you're talking about levels 1 and 2. In reality, when you're talking about SEND, you're talking about right the way up to level 7. In other words, there are no barriers for some young people to access higher education and employment. So I think it's just about myth busting a little bit and also challenging that. So actually we've got some great examples of employers who are really keen to make a difference. And I did have a visit to Stonehill a couple of weeks ago, and I can tell you that they've employed one of their ex-students, and they've got 2 others on a voluntary basis, which is great. That's just some tangible examples, I think, of where it's making a difference.
Thank you for that. And yeah, Charlie, I'll just say. Oh, yes, Charlie, go on.
So the council as an employer, how many people is that employing from Stonehill, and how, you know, former students, and also what is the council doing to encourage departments to take these students on to help them?
So rather than specifically Stonehill, Council Hogarth, because I think it's a wider thing than that. And actually, I'm going to bring both colleagues in at different times, because I think it's appropriate. So the Education and Skills Portfolio Board, that you'll be aware that Councillor Eleni Mayball kind of chairs. One of the things that we've said very clearly, and there are partners on there, is that statement of intent. As a set of partner organisations, what's our commitment in terms of employment? The reason I kind of gave the sign off to my colleagues is because Jane sat next to me is developing an inclusion charter, and that inclusion charter is about saying, so come on, scores on the doors, what are we going to do to support young people in internships, in apprenticeships, in future employment? And that's the ask of that. So I'll let Jane give a very brief thing for that, and then I'll ask Martin to kind of wrap up, if that's okay.
Yes, very briefly, because the inclusion charter needs to go, it's a consultation draft that needs to be presented, discussed, knocked around by the partnership and the representatives on there. But the principle behind it is very much that it's everybody's business is inclusion, and modelling that, and actually it's not just about the schools, it's about the partnerships themselves, self-evaluating and evaluating accurately, and using that charter and the principles within it to engage in that self-evaluation and use appropriate frameworks that are available for that, and then to determine from that evaluation what the priority areas are that they want to then focus on, develop their own improvement plan, and we monitor and evaluate, and the partnership monitors and evaluates itself through peer review with regards to the progress it's making against its own commitment. So it's an expectation of the system and of our society, but of the partnership itself as well. So that's something that, again, with our improvement advisors, as we roll out with the partnership, the inclusion charter itself, yes, it's for schools and with schools, but it's also the partnership leading the way in that space.
And whilst we don't routinely hold data regarding which provisions youngsters have come from when they work in the council, I do think it's a useful suggestion for us to think about as we go through this conversation corporately. But both the council and the local health agencies have committed to supporting and delivering a much higher number of placements, be that supported internships, apprenticeships, or work experience placements for young people with SEND. And so we're currently working through how we deliver that now in a sequence of meetings that are connected to the delivery of the strategy. So I think for the long term, I think it's important for us to be held to account on the scores on the doors about that as we proceed with that piece of work.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and just to give you a bit of a warning, Councillor Empsall has identified this particular area as something for scrutiny panel next year, so you are pre-warned. Oh, sorry, Charlie.
So, how many people in Doncaster Council, which send people, actually took into apprenticeships or something like that? We should be exemplars when it comes to this, and we should be shouting it from the rooftops. But if we ain't got the figures, then there must be somewhere.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that, so we've just started, so we're embarking on this journey with Ernest. I think, Councillor Hogarth, I think that once we have done this for a period of time, we are going to be in a position to answer that question directly. And I think to link it potentially with a wider inclusion charter piece around employability, because actually we almost need to see a full period go through, and we can say, right, over the last year, this is the difference it's made. This is how many young people have got into sort of internships or onto apprenticeships or into kind of roles. What we do publish as a council is actually our employment diversity, don't we? But that doesn't cover what actually we want to exemplify. So I don't think we can do that in a meaningful way, in the way that we would like. We could probably do it in terms of diversity quite easily. But really what we're talking about here is, how many young people have we made a difference for who are now in employment as a result of something that we've implemented? So I guess my ask, Councillor Hogarth, is actually to give us a run of a year at it to then actually come back and say, actually, here's the figures. And by year, I mean municipal year. So in reality, come back and ask us in the next municipal year, and I think we should be able to respond to that challenge.
And that's why, Charlie, that Councillor Upshaw's identified it as something to look at scrutiny next time. Okay.
Can I make a suggestion when it comes to recommendations, that we put a motion or a recommendation to the Cabinet member that Doncaster Council has it in their protocols or whatever to work with these people and commit to employment of a percentage and to train them. That can go to Cabinet or the Mayor.
I don't know, Charlie. Can we do that?
Isn't that what we do, is scrutinise and come up with recommendations?
And I think, in all fairness, Charlie, I think that Leanne said that, I think that Martin said that, And I think that we've also said that as a panel, it's something we want to scrutinise. So I think, to be fair, I think we've asked that question. I think we've been given answers, and maybe not with the answers that you require. But I think in spirit, people have said that that's what's going to happen. So I think bearing in mind what you've said and what's been answered, I think that's in progress already. And I think we just need to let that go through with time.
I think it's brilliant what they're trying to do. And, you know, we need, I think, as much help as possible. And I thought scrutiny was to put recommendations to the cabinet member or the mayor, not just, listen, we've got to come up with something, and I think that should be a recommendation. That goes with, there should be a commitment to include fully and support what is happening, you know, what we're going to start, and it should be started as soon as possible.
Councillor Durant.
I do agree with what you're saying, Charlie, but my honest opinion would be that at the moment I don't think they're ready to put that proposal. I think we can minute the fact that we're committed to seeing those improvements started to take place, at the paperwork, the audit trail is being done, and that shortly they will have a further more meat on the bone to present them for the for scrutiny to look at it and then put it then to accept to it, because I don't think it's quite ready at this moment in time to put to cabinet or the portfolio holder. So for me, I'd like to see a little bit more meat on the bones, more information, more policy, and have an input into that process in developing it, so that we can say, look, this is something really, really positive for our communities and the council, and we want a commitment now about it. So I don't think we're quite there yet, but if we do get a report in the municipal year, then I think that would be then the time to put for that commitment.
I think thank you, Councillor Durant. I think that's absolutely correct. We've discussed it, we can minute it, but I think there's a process being agreed that it's a work in progress. We've agreed to look at it in scrutiny over the coming cycle, next cycle, and I think we need to leave it at that. So thank you, everybody, for the comments on that. Moving on, the question 8 is over to Bob. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think a lot of mine may have already been asked or answered, so...
If you feel that it's been answered, then we can skip along.
I could ask it anyway, shall I just go ahead? In the comments, it says, as part of this strategy, we will work with training providers and employees to ensure that young people with special needs or disabilities are able to access meaningful and successful employment in later life. So basically what I'd like to ask is, what sort of form will this working with training providers and employees take to ensure that meaningful and successful employment is there in later life?
I think you're right, Councillor Anderson.
Yeah,
I think that's been mulled over. Yeah. Unless there's any additional comments, I'm happy to note that that's been discussed already. Yeah. So, okay. So we'll move on to the next question then. But thanks for reading it out so eloquently. Yes. Question 9 is Councillor Bluff.
Paragraph 31 explains under the Education Act of 1996, the local authority has a duty to promote high standards and fair access to education in children and young people's area and community. Why are we only just adhering to it? It feels like because of the escalating costs of out-of-area placements, we are only now considering the Education Act, which is nearly 30 years old.
Okay, I'll start that one off. I just need to say that we have been adhering to the Education Act previously. We haven't ignored it for 30 years. Now, I've not been here for 30 years, but we haven't ignored it for 30 years. I think what's different is actually we are kind of going beyond what is our statutory duty. So the statutory duty says that actually young people need to have access to a provision in there as near as possible. And sometimes that isn't as close to home as we would like. So actually, technically, we've been adhering to it. I think what we're trying to do here is to say, actually, do you know what? For Doncaster, that's not good enough. We want more. So actually, what we're doing is we're developing provision in Doncaster to actually help support that so that young people can stay closer to their communities. So we are adhering to it. but we now actually we're expecting more, I think, for our young people. I think if we were challenged statutorily, would be kind of covered. I think the other point I would say as well is actually literally demand has just outstripped provision. So actually we've outgrown our provision. So a few years ago we'd have had plenty of places for our young people, but even if you look at in the last kind of 12-month period, actually we've gone from just over 1,800 EHCPs to just short of 2,600. So actually even that in itself has made a big difference. We were already embarking on this journey, so it's about us wanting more for our young people. That's kind of my input to that, and I don't know, Martin, if you want to add anything to that.
I think that summarises it, but I think, you know, we have to be conscious of the magnifying effects of the pandemic and the period since. And I think that has shown us where some of the areas for improvement are, without any doubt, in the local system. And those are the things that we've described tonight. You know, I've worked maybe in 5 local areas, and I can see that there's been missed opportunities historically for us to be able to be the best we can be. And so I think for us, you know, whilst, you know, Ofsted have, you know, historically kind of, you know, in terms of SEND, not raised significant concerns about what we're doing and has acknowledged some of the work that's done in the partnership. I think for us, we can see a lot of places where we know we could be getting it better, and that really revolves around making sure that our support for young people in schools is accessed as early as possible, that we're funding appropriately, that there's real accountability about the work that is done, and as I've talked about, you know, at length tonight, that is really the key. And so, you know, for us, this is really about us taking a step forward, and it's morally driven. It's absolutely about getting the right thing for our families, and that's why we put the voice of our children and the voice of our parents and carers right at the heart of the work that we're doing.
Okay, thank you. Any more points on that? Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That concludes the questions. Also over to recommendations, and as before. Does the panel agree with the recommendations outlined in paragraphs 9 and 10? Okay, thank you. That's that done. So next one is the work plan and plan of decisions. That's that over to you. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. The work plan and forward plan of key decisions is circulated for your information. I think, as we've discussed today, Councillor Hempshall is very keen to address what we've been discussing in this meeting, and we'll put that forward at a time to be agreed. So really, it's just there for your information. Anything that you feel that needs adding to the work plan, get in touch with myself or Caroline. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, and I've just got one more thing, and that's to request an update from an earlier recommendation relating to the training being made compulsory in the future for drivers on school transport routes for children with special education needs and disabilities. That were requested before as a recommendation, and the Chair has asked for an update.
I think, Chair, if we can just clarify, recommendations were sent to the Cabinet member. It was responded to, but I think it's about a 6-month period now, and I think the panel just want an update on how things are moving and progressing. So we can send that to the officers, the response from the Cabinet member just requesting an update. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, well, that concludes this evening's meeting. I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance and questions and answers, and I'd wish you all a very good evening. Thank you, everybody.